female sexual anatomy. Amazingly enough, even today, people do not understand the difference between external anatomy and internal anatomy. A great number of people refer to the vulva, which is anything you can see from the outside, as the vagina. The vagina is strictly internal, and you can't really see it without a speculum and a bright light. So, the external is starting in our book with the mons veneris, which also was called the mons pubis, which is a little fatty layer above the pelvic bone, which serves as padding during intercourse. Otherwise, you'd have two pubic bones crashing together rather hard, and it could be painful. So the mons pubis is a padding. It is covered by pubic hair during or at the beginning of puberty. A great number of women now, young women particularly, but even some that are older than that, are shaving their pubic hair. And I'm wondering, I don't know what the cause of that is. I'm thinking, gee, 50 years ago women didn't shave this, but 50 years ago we didn't have disposable razors. And 50 years ago, oral sex was not nearly as common as it is now. I've had students in the past, young ones, that assured me that shaving the female pelvic area was much better because they just felt like the hair was dirty. It trapped urine and menstrual blood, and it was just gross. So they figured if you're shaving your legs, why not go on up and shave it all? And swimming suits are much tinier than they were in the 1950s. And so rather than having hair stick out of the sides of a very small bikini, it is more aesthetically pleasing to shave all the hair off. I'm thinking that makes it a daily chore because stubble is very sharp and uncomfortable. Let's see, what else do we want to know about external anatomy? The external anatomy is called the vulva. Do not say Volvo. That is a car, a small foreign car. I had a friend once who said that she was driving the Mustang today because her son had the vulva. I thought that was an unfortunate phrase for her to use, and it actually didn't surprise me when he was 22 and came out, but I don't think one had anything to do with the other. The labia is the most visible of the external parts. There's a picture in figure 2.3 that is actually photographs, which this is the first textbook I've ever seen that had photographs of genitalia. And I thought that was kind of important because nobody looks like a diagram. This gives 3 different examples of the labia, and in Japanese societies in, say, the 50s, 60s, even 70s, striptease shows very often were not striptease. They weren't considered terribly erotic, but it was very important that the women would squat in front of the men so that they could actually look at this. Their wives were too demure, too shy to ever allow the husband to actually see their genitalia. So men often had no idea what they were working with. They were simply doing the best they could in the dark. The clitoris, very important, because the clitoris is the seat of the female orgasm. The clitoris is very much like a tiny penis. Let me back up here and say something again. I've spent most of my life at the medical career, and one of the most important things that you learn is that In human anatomy, when you are developing in utero before you are born, the male and female anatomy comes from the same type of cells, and it differentiates relatively late. Well, I guess not that late, but still an embryo before things start to differentiate. And as such, there are more variations in anatomy of the genitalia than there are in any other organs. But you consider, just like your nose looks like a nose, but it doesn't look like the same nose as everybody else's nose. Everybody's face has got two eyes, one nose, one mouth, but you don't all look alike. So genitalia is like that too. With genitalia, as they're developing, though, many times you'll find, many times you'll find people that are born with one testicle, one ovary. Many times we don't know, is that a really large clitoris or is it a very small penis? And now we can do DNA testing, but for years we could not. So we would just do surgery to make the baby look as much like an average person as we could. So if it was decided, and they always said it was easier to dig a hole than build a pole. So if they weren't sure if you were male or female, chances are they were going to surgically create a female. Did that change your hormones? Did that change who you were? Not necessarily. They had about a 50-50 chance of being right, but for those poor souls that it wasn't right, it was a pretty miserable existence. The old situation of, I feel like I'm born in the wrong body. My parents dressed me in little girl clothes, but I wanted to be a little boy and play with little boy toys, and this is a major serious problem. We have surgery now that we can create maleness and femaleness, which is an interesting thing. It's never happened before in humanity. Back to the clitoris. Why am I saying this now? Because an amazing thing happened just in my lifetime. And I consider how many anatomy books I have read, how many studies of anatomy have been done since, say, Leonardo da Vinci's time. You look at these pictures of anatomy, and they were all pretty much in agreement. And they all dissected a body the exact same way. They used Rokitansky's incision because he was the master. Well, as time went on and more women were accepted into the hard sciences, they were doing anatomical dissections, and they didn't necessarily follow the old routine of dissect here and find this. In the 1970s, they discovered a new muscle that went from the back of the eye to the back of the mouth. Nobody had, and so they got to name it because nobody had ever even discovered this. Nobody was aware that it existed. I find it very interesting here that under the clitoris it talks about the crura, and they cite a distinct study that was done in 2005. So we didn't know until the 2000s that the clitoris was really bigger than a pea. And indeed, it is shaped more like a wishbone, and there is a whole lot more to the clitoris than we were given credit for a long time. We have had scientists along the way that would tell us things like, that's not a real orgasm. If it's a clitoral orgasm, it's not a real orgasm. You should have a vaginal orgasm because the only legitimate orgasm is one when there's a penis in place. That's an interesting consideration. And I've talked to many women that said during long marriages they never had an orgasm while there was a penis inside their vagina, that they relied on the foreplay, on oral sex rather than penis vaginal penetration sex for an orgasm. This was very disappointing to a lot of men because they were pretty sure their magic penis could always create an orgasm. In fact, you would often hear women that were self-avowed lesbians that men would think that all they needed to do was have sex with them and that had changed their minds. The magic penis syndrome. So the clitoris is much bigger, about the size and shape of the wishbone. So let's see, surgical removal of the clitoris sometimes performed. Yes, parents were really freaked out about kids masturbating and tried to do something to prevent it. And among things that they did was to tie children's hands to the headboard. We call this torture now. Then, and in some cases, little girls that masturbated too much, they would take them to the doctor and he would snip off the clitoris to try to stop the masturbation. And why did they want to stop the masturbation? Just as I talked about in another video, that it would make the child mentally deficient and go blind and possibly be paralyzed. And none of these seem like a good idea, so let's just snip off her clitoris. That will take care of it. A lot of these women are now actually about in their 60s, and they're really pretty bitter about the whole situation. In some cases, the doctors decided that this clitoris was too big, so we need to reduce the size. And they would snip with their little scissors. And again, these women really pretty much resent that, the fact that nobody asked them. So that's a situation. What else can we talk about? The vaginal opening. I found this one interesting. A simple surgical incision can be made at the time of the first menstruation if you don't have menstruation. This is a weird thing. Not everybody gets a hymen. In a lot of societies, a great deal is taken to protect the hymen. We don't want to destroy it because the hymen is the sign of virginity. This is one of the reasons women were not allowed to ride astride on a horse. You rode side saddle. They didn't want women riding a bicycle because it could destroy the hymen. We know now that girls that are very active in sports, or sometimes even girls in their teens that have used tampons instead of pads, will destroy their hymen. The book talks about an imperforate hymen, which means there's no perforation. And they say that when the hymen has no opening, we'll just make a surgical incision and open it. Well, at the time of first menstruation. How do you know it's her first menstruation if she's not bleeding? With many of these girls, it would be that they would be getting sicker and sicker and sicker because the blood was building up in their abdominal cavity, well, in the vagina, and finally backing up into the uterus and causing severe problems. And there were some girls that didn't have this procedure done until they were in their late teens. So, it's an interesting situation. And it used to be, I know, in the 50s, perhaps even in the 60s, you couldn't get a marriage license without a doctor's exam to make sure that you were physically capable of having sex. Now, I guess we just assume you are. And most people, not all, in our society have had sex before marriage. Many people are not really aware that there's a separate opening for the vagina and for the urethra, as well as the anus. There are still girls today, and in the United States, that think they urinate through the clitoris. It's a little freaky that we don't talk about this. Women are more susceptible to urinary tract infections than men. That's because we have a urethra that's about that long. And that's not much protection between the bacteria on the outside and the interior of the bladder, which is a terrific place to grow bacteria.